The dense canopy of Guadalcanal had a silence to it, the stillness of a jungle not yet touched by battle. But as the wind shifted, so did the course of the war. A Japanese patrol, moving cautiously through the undergrowth, froze. At first, it was a mere ripple in the air, the sound of gunfire, but not the kind they expected, not the sporadic bursts of a bolt-action rifle. Instead, a rapid staccato rhythm, almost mechanical, echoed through the trees. The Japanese soldiers stood still, their eyes wide, as the gunfire came in controlled, deliberate shots. Fast, precise, almost unnatural. 8 shots in seconds. The veterans who had lived through years of war now faced a sudden, jarring uncertainty. The belief that Americans were still wielding their slow, cumbersome rifles they had dismissed as clumsy and inefficient, shattered with every pull of that trigger. The soldiers watched, paralyzed, as the lone Marine rifleman calmly dropped his target with the speed of a man in control, yet not hurried. It was an impossible act, an instant's precision from the hands of one man. What had once been a matter of bursts and reloading now was something different. The battlefield shifted, not with a clash of steel or the roar of artillery, but with the sudden, deadly rhythm of semi-automatic fire. The once unchallenged advantage the Japanese had held in the Pacific seemed to waver. But this moment was not a fluke. It wasn't an isolated act of heroism, nor a rare stroke of luck. No, this was the unveiling of a new era in military technology, the tipping point that would change the nature of the war itself. The camera pulls back, revealing a picture that had only begun to form, one of technological revolution. The single Marine firing those 8 rounds in rapid succession was not a mere anomaly. He was a sign of things to come, the first whispers of a revolution that would eventually shape the entire battlefield. Not so long ago, Japanese officers had dismissed the American rifles as clumsy and wasteful. They believed the bolt-action rifle, with its deliberate pace and focused aim, was superior. The weapon's power, they argued, came from precision, not volume. But the American rifleman's demonstration had proven them catastrophically wrong. That one soldier, standing alone in the jungle, was showing the true power of technology, not just in its force, but in its speed. The myth that American rifles were ineffective was about to unravel. And as that myth crumbled, it would leave in its wake a new kind of warfare, one that was faster, more unpredictable, and far more deadly than anything the Japanese had anticipated. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they mocked would soon erase their advantage entirely. In the early 1930s, Japanese military observers, looking from the comfort of their own rapidly modernizing army, cast their eyes over the early prototypes of the American semi-automatic rifle. At first, they were unimpressed, dismissing the design with derision. The rifles were too complicated, they argued, too unreliable, too dependent on delicate mechanisms that could easily be crippled by mud, heat, or the relentless humidity of Asia and the Pacific. They could never stand up to the grueling conditions of jungle warfare, they thought. Their own doctrine, forged in the crucible of years of intense, disciplined training, relied on the old-fashioned ways of the bayonet charge and the unbreakable spirit of the soldier. To them, firepower alone was not enough. In their view, true combat power came not from weapons, but from the strength of the individual soldier, from spiritual superiority, from unyielding discipline, from the will to fight. The American approach was foreign to them, even laughable. How could a soldier be considered strong if they relied on the machine, on technology, rather than their own body and will? To the Japanese military leaders, the American semi-automatic rifle was a symbol of weakness, a crutch for soldiers they believed lacked the resolve to fight as their own men did. But this belief, this assumption, would become their blind spot. As the Japanese mockingly dismissed the weapon and the soldiers who wielded it, they failed to notice the real momentum building in the American military. For while the Japanese doctrine remained rooted in the individual's strength, the United States was evolving its own approach to war, one that emphasized fire superiority, one that prioritized overwhelming force and technological advantage. The American strategy was not based on endurance in the heat of battle or the purity of spiritual resolve, but on the rapid application of overwhelming firepower, on creating an unrelenting barrage that no soldier, no matter how disciplined, could survive. And so, as the years passed, the Japanese assumptions hardened into policy that would in the end prove fatal. They had laughed at the Americans. They had underestimated the very weapon that would shift the tide of the war. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they mocked would soon be the weapon that would defeat them. Japan's leadership, fresh from years of rapid militarization and emboldened by early victories, had crafted a vision of war that was swift, decisive, and brutal. They believed that the Pacific conflict would follow the rhythm of their previous campaigns, lightning-fast, shock-driven attacks, where speed and surprise were paramount. The infantry rifle, in their eyes, was a secondary tool, eclipsed by the power of morale, movement, and the unrelenting charge of the bayonet. Victory, to them, would be claimed by the will to fight, not by the firepower of the weapon. The philosophy of shock and awe dominated their thinking, a belief that the battlefield could be swept clean with sheer momentum. In stark contrast, American planners, deeply scarred by the horrors of World War I, had learned painful lessons in the trenches. They prepared for a very different kind of war, one of attrition, of long, drawn-out engagements in which victory would not be claimed by the speed of the charge, but by the endurance of firepower and the fortitude of soldiers in extended firefights. The rifle, for them, was a cornerstone of that strategy, and so, as both sides geared up for the conflict to come, the seeds of two radically different military cultures had already been planted, one obsessed with swift victory and decisive movements, the other determined to grind out victory through sustained force and technological superiority. But neither side fully understood the way technology would collide with their respective doctrines. The Pacific, vast and unforgiving, would serve as a proving ground for their differing approaches, indifferent to the pride or assumptions that shaped each side's expectations. The Japanese would soon realize that the battlefield they had envisioned, one of quick strikes and rapid advances, was not one they could control, and the Americans, with their focus on preparation for prolonged conflict, would find themselves facing something far more immediate than they anticipated. The clash of these two worldviews would soon be mirrored by the clash of two technologies, each shaped by its own cultural context. The M1 Garand, a rifle designed for rapid fire and sustained power, would soon meet the Arisaka, Japan's own beloved bolt-action rifle, on equal terms. What neither side could foresee, however, was the way this meeting would break the symmetry of battle. The Garand, with its semi-automatic fire, would swiftly make the Arisaka's slow, methodical shots seem obsolete. The quick, overwhelming fire of the American rifle would undermine the very doctrine the Japanese had relied upon, and with that, the war would shift in ways no one had expected. But what the Japanese couldn't yet see was that in the relentless heat of the Pacific, technology would prove more decisive than speed. What they had dismissed as a mere tool would become the key to America's victory. The Arisaka Type 38 and Type 99 rifles were more than just tools of war. They were symbols of Japan's martial past, steeped in a tradition of discipline and endurance. For decades, the Arisaka family of rifles had been the backbone of the Imperial Japanese Army, crafted with precision and simplicity, strong, rugged, and designed to endure the harshest conditions. They were well suited to the Japanese soldier's way of war, a war rooted in honor, patience, and a relentless belief in the superiority of the soldier's spirit. To the officers who carried them, the rifles were not just weapons, they were extensions of a philosophy, a direct link to centuries of military tradition. In the jungles of the Pacific, where the heat and humidity could sap even the most disciplined soldier's strength, the Arisaka seemed like the perfect weapon. It was built to last. Its bolt-action mechanism, though slow by modern standards, was designed to be operated under the most trying circumstances, where dirt, sweat, and grime might slow other rifles to a crawl. Officers trusted the Arisaka because it aligned with their beliefs about combat, close, personal, and determined by the will of the soldier. The weapon's power, they believed, came from a soldier's resolve, not the speed of his fire. The emphasis was on marksmanship, on taking steady, deliberate shots that counted, rather than the barrage of a rapid-fire weapon. The Japanese Army's doctrine was built on this philosophy. Close combat, hand-to-hand engagement, and the intimidating bayonet charge were the hallmarks of their strategy. The Arisaka's bolt-action firepower, slow but precise, fit neatly into this framework. Training, too, mirrored this approach. Soldiers were taught patience, to focus on their individual shots, and to trust in their discipline rather than rely on overwhelming firepower. In such a philosophy, the concept of speed in battle, the ability to lay down a rapid volume of fire, seemed almost irrelevant. Few, if any, could imagine a future where the speed of fire would become the deciding factor in battle. The Japanese leadership, shaped by years of successful, fast-paced campaigns across China and Manchuria, had no reason to question their own assumptions. In their eyes, the battlefield was still one of bayonets and hand-to-hand combat. The rifle was merely an extension of that philosophy. The Arisaka was not seen as something that needed to evolve. It was seen as timeless, a testament to a soldier's strength of character. But this confidence, rooted in tradition and tested by years of combat, would soon become a blind spot. In the Pacific, a new form of warfare was emerging, one that would soon render their rifles' carefully crafted pace obsolete. The belief in the strength of the soldier's resolve was about to face a harsh and unrelenting challenge. In a jungle where speed and volume would define victory, the Arisaka would soon meet an enemy rifle that could outpace it, overrun it, and ultimately break the rhythm of war they had long relied upon. And so, in the heat of the Pacific, the Japanese would soon discover the high cost of ignoring technological change. They would face a weapon that did not rely on tradition or slow, steady precision, but on firepower that could overwhelm their greatest strength, their soldier's will. But what they did not know was that this shift in weaponry would soon change the tide of war, and history would judge their faith in tradition harshly. The echoes of World War I still resonated in the halls of the United States Army, a war that had tested the very limits of endurance and survival. In the trenches of Europe, soldiers had learned that the spirit of the individual soldier could only carry them so far. What truly decided battles, what truly preserved life, was firepower. The American military planners, shaped by the grueling lessons of attrition, knew that in the next war, fire superiority would be the key to survival. The slow, deliberate bolt-action rifles of the past had proven their limits in the face of modern warfare. And so, after the war, the search began for a new kind of rifle, one that would change the course of battle and forever reshape the American way of war. Led by generals who understood the high cost of a single slow shot, the U.S. Army began to look for a rifle that could give soldiers the ability to engage at greater speeds, without sacrificing precision. This was no longer a time for relying solely on the individual's arm or spirit. This was a time to rely on technology, to level the playing field. Enter John C. Garand, an engineer whose designs would come to define the future of American infantry. His early prototypes showed promise. They were faster, more efficient, and capable of sustaining fire without the need for constant reloading. But in the eyes of many, this was still an unproven gamble. Critics questioned the practicality of semi-automatic rifles, concerned that they would jam under the duress of battle, that they would place an unsustainable burden on logistics, and that the rapid consumption of ammunition would leave soldiers vulnerable. The rifles, they argued, might offer speed, but they would be unreliable when it mattered most. Yet the advocates of Garand's design held firm, arguing that the true advantage lay in the ability to deliver controlled fire superiority. They believed that with faster, more accurate fire, American soldiers would not only survive, they would dominate the battlefield. It was a gamble, to be sure, but it was one they were willing to take. The Army's decision to invest in Garand's vision would set the course for the future. They were betting on a future where rifles would not just follow the flow of battle, but would actively shape it, tipping the scales in favor of whoever could wield them with the most efficiency. A quiet revolution was unfolding in the ordnance rooms of the Army, one that would soon echo across every battlefield where the United States would fight. It was a decision that would forever alter the nature of combat, as the promise of semi-automatic fire would transform from an experiment into a weapon that would shape the fate of nations. And in those early days, no one knew just how decisive that gamble would prove to be. The future of warfare was being written, not by the soldiers in the field, but by the engineers who understood that the fight would be decided not by courage alone, but by the speed of the rifle itself. As Garand's rifle took shape, the question remained, would it fulfill the promise, or would it falter when tested in the fires of war? But what they didn't know was that, in the coming years, the weapon that started as a prototype would soon become the key to America's victory, and the bane of their enemies. In 1936, the U.S. Army made a decision that would alter the course of history. The M1 Garand, the world's first standard-issue semi-automatic infantry rifle, was officially adopted, setting the stage for a new era of combat. This was no longer a weapon designed to reflect tradition or rely on the slow, deliberate pace of the bolt-action rifle. The Garand was faster, more lethal, and its adoption marked a pivotal moment for the American military. Yet this groundbreaking decision did not come without its challenges. The program's early years were plagued by production struggles, technical setbacks, delays in mass manufacturing, and constant refinement. Skeptics, both within and outside the Army, were quick to predict failure, and many believed the new rifle would be an impractical tool, ill-suited for the demands of modern warfare. Despite these setbacks, a quiet transformation began within the ranks. Soldiers, trained for the rigid discipline of single-shot rifles, had to adapt to a new style of combat. They learned to fire rapidly, to reload instinctively, and to use their new weapon to dominate open ground. The idea of precision, tempered by the speed of a semi-automatic rifle, took root in their training. The focus was no longer just on individual marksmanship, but on maintaining a constant barrage of fire, a relentless rhythm that would keep the enemy at bay. The Garand's power lay not in its individual shots, but in its ability to allow soldiers to maintain pressure, to never let up. The landscape of the battlefield was changing, one soldier at a time. Meanwhile, in Japan, intelligence reports began to trickle in, fragments of information about the new American weapon. But these reports, often incomplete or unclear, were dismissed by Japanese military leaders as exaggerations. The idea that the Americans had developed a semi-automatic rifle, capable of rapid fire and sustained combat, seemed impossible to many. After all, they believed, the American soldier was soft, their technology untested, and they assumed no rifle could withstand the brutal conditions of the Pacific War. They clung to the belief that such weapons would fail under combat strain, that the American soldier's reliance on technology would be his undoing. Arrogance, however, had woven its way into the very fabric of Japanese doctrine. For years they had prided themselves on their unyielding discipline, on their soldiers' spiritual resolve, and their ability to overcome any technological disadvantage. This belief, this unwavering faith in their traditional ways of combat, became doctrine. And as doctrine became planning, they failed to account for the reality of the American rifle, a rifle that could lay down consistent, overwhelming fire in the face of any attack. The gap between what they believed and the reality that was quietly unfolding in America grew wider each day. The Japanese were blind to the weapon that was steadily shaping the future of warfare. What they failed to recognize was that, when the time came, this new weapon would erase their advantage entirely. But what they didn't know was that the M1 Garand was already silently changing the rules of the game, and when it finally met them on the battlefield, it would prove the most decisive shift of the war. As the storm clouds of war gathered on the horizon, U.S. factories began a monumental shift. The M1 Garand, once a concept in the hands of visionary engineers, was now an industrial product. The United States was on the eve of war, and its military needed a rifle that could not only meet the demands of modern combat, but could be produced at a scale never before seen. The challenge was daunting, transforming a relatively untested prototype into a weapon that could be supplied in the millions. The factories that had once built civilian products now retooled their entire operations to churn out a rifle that would embody the future of warfare. Each assembly line, every machine, was dedicated to the singular purpose of mass-producing the M1 Garand. Engineers, now under the pressure of wartime production, faced a series of obstacles that threatened to derail the program. Heat treatment, the delicate process that hardened the metal to withstand the wear and tear of battle, had to be perfected. The rifle's gas system, which allowed for rapid semi-automatic fire, required fine-tuning to ensure that it functioned flawlessly under the most extreme conditions. Machining tolerances were tightened to ensure each rifle met the rigorous standards of precision and reliability. These challenges were not small, nor was the timeline forgiving. Yet, through relentless experimentation and refinement, the engineers solved these problems one by one. What had once been an ambitious idea was slowly transforming into a reliable instrument of war. The rifle was now ready for the next stage, testing. The logistical challenges, however, were just as great. With a war now inevitable, the U.S. Army had to ensure that the Garand, in its newfound mass production, was supported by an equally robust supply chain. Millions of clips, barrels, and spare parts needed to be manufactured and delivered to soldiers on the front lines. The American logistics system, already tested by years of industrial growth, adapted quickly. Warehouses and depots sprang up across the nation, storing the parts and ammunition that would feed this new weapon of war. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking, but it was a machine that was running at full capacity, a testament to the United States' industrial might. Meanwhile, soldiers in training began to bond with the M1 Garand, learning to trust its reliability. What had once been a curiosity, a prototype, was now a trusted companion. They learned to fire rapidly, to reload instinctively, and to maintain their rifles in the harshest of conditions. Soldiers tested the Garand in mud and rain, through the sweltering heat of southern camps and the freezing winds of northern training grounds. And, time and again, the rifle performed, without fail. Its gas system continued to cycle, its barrel remained true, its mechanics endured. The rifle was more than a weapon. It became a symbol of the American soldier's strength. It was a tool forged for war, tested and proven in the crucible of rigorous training. Across the ocean, Japanese planners remained convinced that the complexities of the M1 Garand would ultimately doom it. They assumed that under pressure, the intricate systems, the gas operation, the rapid cycling action, would fail in the mud, the heat, and the rain of the Pacific. To them, the American rifle was a fragile instrument, one that would falter at the first sign of combat strain. Their own weapons, simpler and more traditional, were built to endure such conditions. The Japanese military, clinging to its doctrine of simplicity and discipline, believed that technology could not replace the indomitable spirit of the soldier. But the field tests in the harsh conditions of the Pacific would soon prove the Japanese planners wrong. The M1 Garand, which had been forged in the industrial heart of America, stood up to the most punishing tests. It worked when the Japanese rifles failed. It functioned in ways that no one had fully predicted. The rifle's reliability under fire became legendary, and as the first American forces went into combat, it became clear that the United States was entering the war with a fundamentally different instrument of infantry combat. And as that rifle was carried across the battlefields of the Pacific, it would redefine the way wars were fought, one shot at a time. The gap between the traditional weaponry of the past and the firepower of the future was about to be revealed in ways the Japanese could never have foreseen. The Garand was not just a weapon, it was a revolution. But what they didn't know was that the rifle they mocked would soon reshape the course of the war, and with it, the fate of nations. As the United States ramped up its preparations for war, the training of its soldiers shifted to match the capabilities of the M1 Garand. The old traditions of military discipline, which had once focused heavily on the ritual of bayonet charges, gave way to something more practical and revolutionary. Drill instructors, aware of the firepower now at their soldiers' fingertips, emphasized volume and accuracy. They taught recruits to fire 8 controlled shots in rapid succession, to form tight groups with each pull of the trigger. The soldiers were not just to aim, they were to shoot fast and shoot true, with a rifle capable of delivering sustained fire with incredible precision. As they practiced, they learned not just to seize the trigger, but to harness the rifle's potential, mastering the art of rapid reloading and continuous fire. The M1 Garand, in their hands, became more than a weapon. It became an extension of their will, an instrument that allowed them to dominate the battlefield without waiting for the slow, deliberate pace of traditional rifles. Marksmanship culture began to evolve within the ranks, where speed and precision were no longer seen as mutually exclusive. Every soldier learned to fire rapidly and accurately, a far cry from the traditional methods of 1 shot per minute. The Garand's gas-operated system allowed for rapid follow-up shots, and as the recruits trained, they understood that in combat, every second mattered. They were not taught to wait for the perfect shot, but to fire with controlled, overwhelming force. The ability to keep the enemy under constant fire, to suppress their movements, and keep them from advancing, was the key to victory. The American soldier, it seemed, was being prepared for a war of fire superiority, one where the battlefield would be shaped not by the slow, methodical advance of infantry, but by the quick and decisive actions of soldiers trained to use their rifles efficiently, almost instinctively. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the Japanese military's approach to training remained firmly rooted in tradition. Their emphasis was still on aggression, courage, and the supremacy of willpower. soldiers were trained to believe that their bravery, their spirit, could overcome any technical disadvantage. The bayonet charge, a relic of past wars, was still seen as the pinnacle of combat, the moment when the soldier's resolve would triumph over any material weapon. The Japanese believed that no rifle, no technology, could replace the power of a soldier's heart and soul. They drilled their men to be unyielding, to fight with ferocity, and to charge into battle, often without the necessary cover or firepower to win. Their philosophy, though powerful, was built on the belief that willpower could overcome any technological hurdle. In contrast, the American recruits, equipped with the Garand, had learned to use their ammunition liberally, to fire not just when they had a clear shot, but when they could keep pressure on the enemy. To them, ammunition was not a precious resource to be conserved, but a tool to be used without hesitation. This was a luxury that the Japanese could not match. The sheer volume of fire the Americans could sustain, coupled with their ability to aim with precision, made them a force unlike anything their enemies had encountered. For the Japanese, every round of ammunition counted. Their rifles, often slower and less reliable under fire, could not keep up with the rapid pace of American fire. The difference was not just technical, it was psychological. The contrast between the two armies' mentalities grew sharper with every passing day. The American soldier, taught to be adaptable, quick-thinking, and resourceful, valued initiative above all. They were trained to make decisions on the fly, to recognize opportunities in the chaos of battle, and to act upon them swiftly. In contrast, the Japanese soldier was taught to follow orders with unflinching obedience, to charge forward, no matter the odds, in the belief that courage alone could carry them to victory. The psychological divide between the two armies became clear. One army valued the ability to act and adapt to the situation at hand, while the other clung to the idea that obedience and tradition would win the day. As the American recruits trained, they grew more confident in their ability to wield their new weapon, knowing it gave them a decisive edge. They were ready for the coming conflict, prepared not just to fight, but to dominate. The Japanese, however, remained unconvinced. They could not yet see how the speed and precision of the Garand would change the nature of the war, but the men of the United States Army, fully trained and armed with the rifle that had been forged for a new kind of warfare, were prepared for a battle the enemy could not even begin to imagine. But what they didn't know was that the American soldier, armed with his new rifle, was about to face an enemy that would not yield easily. The clash of these two philosophies, one built on speed and precision, the other on unbreakable will, would soon ignite on the battlefields of the Pacific. The first engagements in the Philippines offered only a glimpse of the M1 Garand's potential, as its power had yet to be fully tested on a large scale. The skirmishes were small, the soldiers still adjusting to their new rifles, but the early signs were undeniable. American forces, already accustomed to their rifles' speed and precision, started to use the Garand to devastating effect. However, the true impact of the weapon wouldn't become apparent until the Marines landed on Guadalcanal. There, in the dense jungles of the Solomon Islands, the M1 would have its moment, not as a tool of promise, but as the decisive force that reshaped the war. As the Marines engaged in fierce combat on the island, they unleashed a torrent of semi-automatic fire for the first time in major combat. The sound was alien to the Japanese soldiers. What began as the crack of single shots rapidly intensified, creating a staccato of rapid-fire bursts, overwhelming and constant. To the untrained ear of the Japanese infantry, it sounded like the rattle of machine guns. The precision of the American rifle was now no longer just an advantage in theory. It had become a weapon of sheer dominance. The Japanese, who had assumed that their infantry tactics and bayonet charges would hold the line, were now confronted with an overwhelming force they could not counter. Their officers, seasoned by years of battle, soon realized, far too late, that their entire worldview, built on years of military tradition, had collapsed in minutes. The jungle, thick with humidity and the scent of wet earth, became a testing ground for two opposing military philosophies. On one side stood the Japanese, whose doctrine still revered the discipline of the soldier and the swift, decisive charge. On the other, the Americans, wielding the Garand with precision, firepower, and control. As the battle raged on, it became increasingly clear that firepower was the deciding factor. The jungle, which had once been a formidable barrier to traditional combat strategies, now revealed its deeper truth. Fire superiority was the key to survival. No longer could soldiers rely solely on individual resolve. The battle was no longer about courage in close quarters. It was about overwhelming the enemy with rapid, sustained fire. The American infantry, armed with their semi-automatic rifles, began to blunt the Japanese assaults with a force that had once seemed unimaginable. What would have previously been an overwhelming attack, a flood of soldiers charging headlong into a defensive line, was now stopped in its tracks by the consistent, relentless fire of American troops. Where once a handful of men might have been able to hold a position for a few minutes, now entire units stood firm, their rifles providing a constant barrage of suppressive fire that the enemy could not match. And the traditional methods of warfare, the close-quarters combat that had defined so many battles in the Pacific, seemed increasingly ineffective. The new weapon, capable of sustaining fire at a rate that once seemed impossible, had irrevocably altered the nature of infantry combat. In the minds of the Japanese officers, the truth was sinking in slowly. The technology they had so confidently dismissed was now their most formidable opponent. Their soldiers, conditioned to fight with courage, were now being crushed by the sheer speed and volume of American fire. The assumptions they had held for years about the superiority of their doctrine, about the invincibility of their traditional tactics, were being exposed as myths. The gap between belief and reality, once narrow, had now become an insurmountable chasm. The jungle, where so many battles had been fought in the past, had become a laboratory for new ways of war. And in this laboratory, firepower, not discipline, not spirit, proved to be the deciding factor. What was now at stake in these brutal engagements was more than just victory or defeat. The struggle had become existential, adapt or be consumed by the new technological reality. The Japanese, clinging to outdated strategies, could not keep up with the pace of change. Their rifles, slower, less reliable, and incapable of matching the Garand speed, were rendered obsolete in the face of modern warfare. The old ways, the ways that had once brought them success, now stood as a hindrance to survival. On the other side, the Americans, though they too had once questioned the future of their rifle, were now seeing the fruits of their gamble. The Garand, once a promise in the hands of engineers and soldiers, had proven itself in combat. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they mocked, the rifle they had underestimated, would soon erase their advantage entirely and change the nature of warfare forever. For centuries, warfare had been shaped by the element of surprise, by the dead of night when visibility was at its lowest, and every soldier could be both predator and prey. Japanese doctrine, refined over years of conflict, had placed great emphasis on nighttime infiltration. The cover of darkness was not just a strategic advantage. It was the very essence of their fighting spirit. Japanese soldiers were trained to move unseen, to strike swiftly, and to overwhelm their enemies with sudden, brutal charges. Night was their ally, and they believed it was the key to their success in the Pacific. Yet, when the Japanese assault on Henderson Field began, that certainty started to unravel. For weeks, American forces had prepared for just such an attack. They knew that the Japanese would strike under the cover of darkness, that they would press forward in a relentless series of charges. But what the Japanese soldiers did not anticipate was that the Marines, armed with their new M1 Garands, would respond in a way that completely upended the rules of warfare. Repeated assaults met walls of semi-automatic fire. The Japanese soldiers, accustomed to the pauses between shots fired by traditional bolt-action rifles, were now faced with a constant barrage of fire that never stopped. The Garand's rapid, rhythmic firing seemed as if the rifle itself was firing faster than thought. There was no time to regroup, no breath between the chaos of each round. For the first time, the psychological edge that the Japanese had once enjoyed under the cover of night began to slip away. The Marines fired and reloaded with mechanical precision, their rifles never relenting, creating a curtain of fire that swept across the night. The Japanese soldiers, who had once relied on their ability to move unseen and strike with lightning speed, found themselves caught in a nightmare of sustained fire. The pauses they had counted on to close the distance disappeared. Their morale, once bolstered by the surety that their tactics would overwhelm any enemy, began to disintegrate under the weight of the constant barrage. The night, once their sanctuary, became a place where they could no longer hide. It was as if the very laws of warfare had been rewritten in the space of a few days, the relentless fire of the Garand shattering the traditions that had once seemed invincible. In the aftermath of the failed attacks, survivors reported the shock of facing rifles that seemed to fire as fast as thought. It wasn't just the speed of the Garand, it was the sense of inevitability, the feeling that no matter how fast they moved or how silent they tried to be, they could never outrun the American rifles. The psychological impact was profound. What had once been a battlefield where courage and resolve determined the outcome now felt like a place where technology had taken control, where the sheer power of American firepower could defeat them before they ever closed the gap. For the first time, Japanese soldiers were faced with a war of attrition they were unprepared for, and that realization was as damaging as any bullet. Back at command, Japanese officers struggled to understand what had just occurred. They had been trained to rely on surprise, on movement, and on the overwhelming charge that would push enemy forces into retreat. Yet in the face of American firepower, those tactics were rendered obsolete. For decades, the Japanese military had honed these methods, believing them to be their greatest strength. And now, in a matter of weeks, those tactics were unraveling. The problem wasn't one of will or bravery. It wasn't even one of courage under fire. It was the simple, brutal fact that the rifles of their opponents could deliver sustained, overwhelming fire, and theirs could not. As commanders attempted to regroup and rethink their approach, a turning point emerged. The rifle, once a tool of individual soldiers, was no longer just an instrument of war. It had become a strategic force multiplier. No longer did American forces need to wait for the perfect shot. No longer did they need to rely on individual marksmanship alone. The Garand's speed and power had changed the nature of the battlefield itself, turning a single soldier into a force capable of reshaping the fight. The American rifle was no longer just a weapon. It was a key component of the strategy that would ultimately determine the course of the Pacific War. The battlefield had become a proving ground for the shift in warfare, and it was clear those who could not adapt, those who clung to the old ways, would be consumed by the new reality. The night, which had once been the domain of the Japanese soldier, was now a place where the American rifle would reign supreme. It was no longer just a question of whether they could survive the night. It was whether they could survive the firepower that could be unleashed in an instant. But what they didn't know was that this new power, this new way of fighting would soon become a force so dominant that it would forever change the course of the war. And as the Japanese reeled from their first devastating encounters with the M1 Garand, the reality of this new warfare began to set in. The rules had changed, the old order had been replaced, and the night, once a symbol of their strength, would soon become a place of unimaginable danger. As the war in the Pacific unfolded, American units began to integrate the M1 Garand into a broader strategy, combining it with the firepower of machine guns and mortars to create a layered defense that would prove nearly impenetrable. The concept of fire superiority, of not just holding a position, but dominating it with overwhelming, sustained fire, became central to American tactics. With the Garand's rapid, semi-automatic fire at the heart of these strategies, small squads of Marines or soldiers could stand firm against larger formations of Japanese troops. The rifle's speed allowed them to maintain continuous fire, each shot a reminder of the overwhelming force they could bring to bear. This new approach to warfare, combining infantry firepower with heavy support, changed the balance of power on the ground. For the Japanese, accustomed to closing the distance and engaging in hand-to-hand combat, the reality of facing a weapon like the Garand was a rude awakening. They had once relied on the speed and surprise of their nighttime infiltration tactics to take enemy positions, but now the American soldiers, entrenched with their semi-automatic rifles, were able to hold ground with an intensity and consistency that the Japanese had never experienced. As each new assault met walls of rapid fire, Japanese commanders realized that they had only one choice: close the distance, fast, or face annihilation from a force that could shoot with the speed of thought. The challenge was clear, but the terrain and the physical fatigue of their troops made it nearly impossible to execute successful charges. The Pacific Theater, with its dense jungles, steep hills, and treacherous terrain, was not the ideal setting for the kind of rapid, close-quarters combat the Japanese had trained for. The very environment that had once given them an advantage now worked against them. For every step forward, they were met with a barrage of Garand fire, each bullet a relentless, mechanical reminder of the changing tides of war. What had been a swift charge became a grueling slog as Japanese troops found themselves pinned down, unable to advance against the unyielding American fire. Fatigue, too, began to take its toll. The once vaunted Japanese endurance, their ability to press forward no matter the cost, was tested to its limits as the battle dragged on. Reports from the front lines began to trickle back to Tokyo, detailing the extraordinary impact of the unusual American rifles. These rifles, capable of rapid, sustained fire, were described as game changers. For the first time, the Japanese military realized that the firepower the Americans were able to deliver was far beyond anything they had anticipated. The report spoke of American soldiers firing as fast as they think, a phrase that underscored the almost unnatural speed of American infantry. The Garand, once mocked by Japanese officers as overly complex and unreliable, was now an undeniable force on the battlefield. It was a realization that began to shift the balance of power. Back in Japan, the military leadership began to debate the feasibility of adopting or copying the semi-automatic rifle. Could they produce a similar weapon, one that could match the speed and firepower of the Garand? Some officers believed it was essential, but the demands of Japan's war economy proved a major obstacle. To develop and mass-produce such a weapon would require resources that Japan simply did not have. The M1 Garand, with its intricate gas system and semi-automatic action, was a product of American industry, a result of years of research and refinement, and its adoption could not be replicated quickly enough to make a difference in the war. The question of whether the Japanese could catch up technologically or whether they would be forever outpaced by American innovation was becoming clear. The turning point in the Pacific was complete. Technology, not strategy, not willpower, not tradition, was dictating the terms of combat. The old methods, those honed over decades of military tradition, had been rendered obsolete in the face of a new kind of warfare. The Garand's rapid fire and its integration into broader tactical frameworks meant that the Americans were no longer just fighting with rifles. They were wielding firepower as a strategic force in its own right. The Japanese, for all their courage and training, could not match this innovation. But what they didn't know was that this technological shift, this new age of fire superiority, would soon define the future of warfare, making their old tactics as obsolete as the rifles they had once dismissed. As the battle for the Pacific raged on, the fate of entire armies would soon hinge not on the bravery of individual soldiers, but on the speed at which they could bring fire to bear. The Pacific War, with its dense jungles and isolated islands, became a proving ground for the effectiveness of military doctrine. In 1943, the battles fought across New Georgia, Bougainville, and Tarawa reinforced one undeniable truth. The American soldier's rifle had altered the rules of engagement. Each of these battles, fought under the brutal sun and stifling heat, exposed the limitations of the Japanese approach, particularly their reliance on the slow, methodical cycling of the Arisaka bolt-action rifle. While the Arisaka was a reliable weapon for the tasks it was designed for, it simply could not keep pace with the tempo of the American infantry squads. The Garand, with its semi-automatic action, allowed American troops to deliver a volume of fire that the Japanese soldiers had never encountered. The Arisaka's deliberate pace was no match for the barrage of shots that came from the American lines. The result was a battlefield where the Japanese could no longer count on their traditional tactics to overwhelm their enemies. The Japanese marksmen, always deadly and skilled, could still pick off targets with chilling accuracy. However, even these sharpshooters were rendered less effective when faced with the constant barrage of American rifle fire. As the American infantry squads moved through the dense jungles and across the open beaches of the Pacific Islands, they made use of their semi-automatic rifles to provide a ceaseless wave of fire. It was a power they could wield at will, covering every inch of the battlefield with rapid, precise shots. This fire superiority, once unimaginable in previous wars, rendered massed Japanese attacks increasingly futile. No longer could the Japanese soldier close in with the speed and surprise that had once been their hallmark. Instead, the overwhelming fire of the Garand shattered their coordinated movements before they even reached American lines. For American commanders, it became increasingly clear that the M1 Garand was the backbone of their infantry power. The rifle had transformed the way their troops fought, no longer relying on the slow, controlled advance, but on the ability to project firepower at any given moment. Each soldier, armed with the Garand, was capable of holding back entire waves of enemy soldiers with rapid, sustained fire. The effectiveness of the rifle in the heat of battle made it the centerpiece of American strategy. From squad-level engagements to full-scale assaults, the Garand became a tool for domination, ensuring that no attack would be unopposed. As the months wore on, the American forces grew more confident in their ability to fight and win, knowing they could rely on their rifle to maintain the upper hand. As American soldiers moved from one victory to the next, the Japanese veterans who survived these battles began to speak of the M1 Garand with a kind of reluctant respect, even admiration. They recognized the power that lay in the American rifle, a power that had turned the tide of battle in ways they had not foreseen. They spoke of it with a reverence usually reserved for the most feared and respected weapons in warfare. No longer did they underestimate the Americans or their technology. What had once been dismissed as a fragile and ineffective tool had now proven itself on the battlefield, and the Japanese soldiers, despite their traditional courage and discipline, could not ignore its decisive impact. The psychological shift was profound. Where once they had held the advantage in tactics and close-quarters combat, they now faced an adversary whose technology had made their own methods seem obsolete. By late 1943, the psychological advantage had completely flipped. What had once been the Japanese belief in their superiority, their discipline, their courage, their ability to overwhelm with sheer force, had yielded to a hard, painful reality. The American soldiers, armed with their semi-automatic rifles, could now sustain the kind of firepower that shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. The belief in traditional tactics, so deeply ingrained in the Japanese military, had been overtaken by the relentless reality of the battlefield. The new technology, embodied in the Garand, had erased the Japanese advantage and reshaped the very nature of combat in the Pacific. The American soldiers no longer fought with the same uncertainty that had marked their earlier campaigns. They fought with the confidence of men who knew that, with their rifles, they held the power to win. The climax of the struggle had settled into certainty. Belief, once the foundation of Japan's military doctrine, had been replaced by the hard consequences of technological change. The once unshakable faith in their tactics, their endurance, and their will to fight had proven insufficient against the force of a rifle that could fire faster than their warriors could charge. As the Pacific campaign continued, the Japanese faced an uncomfortable truth. The war they had prepared for, the war they had envisioned, was no longer their own. The battlefield had been transformed, and the M1 Garand had played a central role in that transformation. It had gone from a tool of individual soldiers to a symbol of the power that now shaped the course of the war. But what they didn't know was that the weapon they had underestimated was not only changing the outcome of their battles, it was changing the very future of warfare. By the summer of 1943, analysts reviewing the performance of American forces in the Pacific came to a conclusion that would shift the trajectory of the war. The M1 Garand, the semi-automatic rifle that had been met with skepticism and doubt, was proving to be a decisive factor in reducing U.S. casualty rates during small unit engagements. In the chaos of close-quarters combat, where the ability to sustain fire could make the difference between life and death, the Garand's rapid rate of fire was a game-changer. American infantry, armed with this new weapon, could hold their ground against much larger enemy forces, using their rifles to suppress and outmaneuver the enemy. The reliability of the Garand, its ability to deliver a continuous stream of fire with minimal effort, allowed U.S. soldiers to maintain cohesion even under extreme pressure. As confidence in the weapon grew, so too did the confidence of the soldiers who carried it. No longer did they feel vulnerable in the face of a massed assault. They knew that their rifles would cover them, that their firepower could turn the tide in an instant. For the Japanese, the realization was slow, but it was coming. Their doctrine had long relied on the supremacy of the individual soldier's spirit. Training had emphasized the power of the bayonet charge, the aggressive rush of the infantry, and the belief that discipline and courage could overcome any technological disadvantage. But the Garand was proving that spirit alone could not overcome mechanical disparity. Japanese officers, witnessing the effectiveness of American firepower firsthand, began to reassess their long-held assumptions. They had believed that their soldiers, trained in the art of close combat and quick strikes, could overpower any rifle-based defense. But the Garand, with its rapid semi-automatic action, made these assumptions increasingly untenable. The rifle's capacity for sustained fire shattered the traditional balance of power. The Japanese, once masters of battlefield initiative, were finding themselves outmatched by a weapon that demanded a new kind of warfare, one they were not prepared to fight. Though the Arisaka rifle remained a rugged and reliable weapon in its own right, it was now strategically outclassed. The bolt-action design, while durable and effective in the hands of skilled marksmen, could not compete with the volume of fire the Garand could deliver. In close engagements, where speed and continuous fire were paramount, the Arisaka could not keep pace. This technological gap was not just a matter of rifles, it was a reflection of the broader industrial divide between the two nations. While the United States could produce vast quantities of Garands, outfitting their troops with the most advanced infantry weapons available, Japan found itself increasingly strained. The Japanese war economy, already under immense pressure from the demands of a global conflict, could not afford the luxury of competing technology. The cost of developing a semi-automatic rifle to rival the M1 Garand was simply beyond their reach. The impact of this disparity extended beyond the battlefield and into the very core of Japanese military strategy. Unable to arm their soldiers with the same technological advantages, Japanese forces were left to rely on the strategies and tactics they had used for decades. But as each new engagement unfolded, it became more and more apparent that these strategies were no longer sufficient. The technological gulf between the two sides had widened to the point where Japan's reliance on traditional methods, the charge, the ambush, the surprise assault, was not just outdated, it was suicidal. American forces, equipped with a rifle that could lay down continuous, overwhelming fire, were capable of neutralizing these tactics before they could even take root. For the United States, the M1 Garand became a symbol not just of technological superiority, but of American industrial might. It represented the ability to meet the demands of modern warfare, to produce the tools necessary to ensure victory on an unprecedented scale. The Garand was not merely a weapon, it was a product of a nation's capacity to adapt, to innovate, and to arm its soldiers with the tools they needed to succeed. And as the rifle's role in the war grew, so did its symbolic weight. It was the embodiment of a war machine fueled by the power of American industry, a machine that had transformed the nature of warfare and would continue to shape the outcome of battles from Saipan to Okinawa and beyond. The ripple effects of the Garand's impact were felt in every campaign that followed. From the brutal fight for the Mariana Islands to the harrowing battle for Okinawa, the M1 Garand would prove to be a weapon of not just individual soldiers, but of entire military strategies. Its capacity for sustained fire gave American units an edge in every engagement, helping to neutralize Japanese infantry charges and reshape the very nature of combat. What had once been a question of survival was now a matter of dominance. But what they didn't know was that the technology they had dismissed, the weapon they had underestimated, would soon erase their advantage entirely and shift the momentum of the war in ways they could never have imagined. The battlefield had changed, and with it, the fate of nations would soon be sealed. As the war drew to a close, the impact of the M1 Garand rippled far beyond the Pacific theater. Analysts from nations across the world, both allies and adversaries, began to study the rifle with an intensity that mirrored the way it had shaped the battlefield. It was not just the mechanical workings of the weapon they sought to understand, but the deeper implications it had on warfare itself. The Garand had proved to be more than just a superior firearm. It had demonstrated a fundamental shift in the way combat would be fought in the future. Its semi-automatic action, capable of delivering rapid, sustained fire with unrelenting precision, had proven to be a decisive factor in small unit engagements, where the ability to outpace the enemy was everything. military leaders and strategists now looked back on the war with new eyes, recognizing that the era of bolt-action dominance had ended almost overnight. In the years that followed, nations around the world began to adjust their military strategies, realizing that the Garand's design represented the future of infantry weapons. Countries that had once relied on bolt-action rifles, which demanded deliberate, measured shots, now shifted their focus to semi-automatic or select-fire rifles. They understood that the lesson of the Pacific was clear. Fire superiority was no longer a luxury, but a necessity. The rapid-fire technology that had been at the heart of America's success had to be incorporated into their own arsenals if they were to keep pace in the next conflict. The American rifle, once seen as a symbol of industrial might, became the model for future infantry weapons. What had started as a solitary innovation now reverberated across the global military landscape, influencing the development of weapons in the years to come. For Japanese veterans, the Garand was a weapon that had been beyond their comprehension, a shock they had never anticipated. In the aftermath of the war, as they reflected on the battles they had fought, many admitted a certain grudging respect for the rifle. They recognized that the rapid, sustained fire of the Garand had shattered their doctrines. For decades, they had placed their faith in the strength of the soldiers' resolve, in the ability of their infantry to overwhelm the enemy with sheer willpower. But they had not accounted for the power of a rifle that could maintain fire without pause, that could turn the tide of a battle before a soldier could even reach the enemy lines. The Garand had proven that technology could surpass human endurance, and in doing so, it had exposed the vulnerability of a strategy built on tradition rather than innovation. The war had shown an undeniable truth. Technology and doctrine must evolve together, or they will perish together. The Japanese, whose tactics had once been the model of battlefield innovation, were now faced with the consequences of not adapting quickly enough. Their reliance on traditional methods, the charge, the bayonet, the individual soldier's courage, had not been enough to overcome the technological gap created by the M1 Garand. The rifle had not just outpaced their strategies, it had dismantled them. For the Japanese, as for many other nations, the lessons of the war were not just about the devastating losses they suffered, but about the failure to recognize and adapt to the changing face of warfare. In the years after the war, the M1 Garand became a case study in humility before innovation. It was a weapon that had changed the battlefield, not through overwhelming firepower alone, but through the realization that technology had the power to dictate the terms of engagement. The Garand was a testament to the ability of technology to shape the course of history, to turn the tide of war with a single, well-designed weapon. For all its power, the rifle was also a symbol of the vulnerability of pride. The reluctance to adapt, the belief that tradition could triumph over technology, was a fatal mistake, one that cost the Japanese and others dearly. History, in its careful analysis, records not just the battles and victories, but the irony of how pride delayed adaptation, how stubborn adherence to outdated doctrines led to downfall. In the wake of the war, as nations studied the American rifle, they understood the broader lesson. Progress was inevitable, and those who failed to evolve with it would inevitably be left behind. The M1 Garand, a product of American ingenuity, had not only changed the course of the Pacific War, it had fundamentally altered the course of military history. The rifle's impact went beyond the battlefield, leaving an indelible mark on the way future wars would be fought. But what they didn't know was that in that moment of technological transformation, they were witnessing a fundamental shift that would shape the future of warfare for generations to come. The battlefield had been forever changed, and the echoes of the Garand's legacy would be heard in every conflict that followed. The story returns to that moment in the jungle, a fleeting instant when the sound of rifle fire echoed through the dense foliage of Guadalcanal, and the confident laughter of Japanese soldiers turned to alarm. It was a moment that signified not just a shift in tactics, but a profound change in the nature of war itself. What had once been dismissed as a clumsy American weapon, incapable of withstanding the rigors of combat, had just proved itself in a way that would haunt the Japanese for the rest of the war. A single Marine rifleman, armed with the M1 Garand, had fired 8 rounds in a matter of seconds, forcing a new understanding of what battlefield dominance meant. In that brief flash of time, a weapon that had been mocked for its complexity and fragility reshaped the very landscape of infantry combat across 2 vast oceans. The M1 Garand did more than just outshoot its adversaries. It upended centuries of military tradition. Japan's assumptions about warfare, about the primacy of courage and bayonet charges, were revealed as dangerously outdated. Their belief that technology could never replace the power of individual resolve had been tested, and it had failed. Japan had built its military doctrine on the shoulders of a long-standing tradition, relying on the warrior spirit and the strength of individual soldiers. But in the face of sustained rapid fire, their entire approach crumbled. They had assumed that their bolt-action rifles, slow but reliable, could be enough. They had underestimated the speed of fire, the psychological power of a rifle that never paused, and in doing so, they sealed their fate. America, on the other hand, had gambled on innovation. The M1 Garand was a risk, a weapon built on a new kind of technology, one that demanded faith in both design and manufacturing. The rifle was complex, intricate, and its future uncertain, but the gamble proved decisive. In the heat of combat, it allowed American soldiers to fight not just with speed and accuracy, but with a sense of invulnerability. They could hold positions longer, suppress enemy movements more effectively, and strike with unrelenting force. The Garand's rapid semi-automatic action had proved itself in the brutal reality of war, giving the United States an advantage it could exploit across the Pacific. America's willingness to embrace change had reshaped the battlefield, and with it, the war itself. Years later, veterans from both sides would reflect on the M1 Garand with a respect born of shared experience. On the American side, it was acknowledged not as a symbol of technological superiority, but as a tool that, in the right hands, had made survival possible. For the Japanese, the rifle was a reminder of the harsh lessons they had learned too late. Many veterans admitted, in the quiet aftermath of battle, that the Garand was a weapon of fairness. It did not play favorites. It was unforgiving. Its power lay not just in its firepower, but in its ability to level the playing field, to make the difference between life and death. For both sides, it was a reminder of how quickly and brutally the rules of war could change, and how devastating it could be to underestimate the power of innovation. The M1 Garand did not win the war alone. No single weapon, no single piece of technology could ever claim that honor. The courage of soldiers, the strategies of generals, the resolve of entire nations, all of these factors played a part. But the Garand was a pivotal force, one that altered the course of every life it touched. It was the great equalizer, a symbol of how technology could shift the tides of battle and how the failure to adapt could cost everything. Its influence stretched far beyond the jungles of the Pacific, shaping the way future wars would be fought and how military doctrine would evolve. The rifle that was once mocked had proven itself in the crucible of combat. As the world moved beyond the war, the lessons written in spent brass remained etched in the memories of those who lived through it. They had once laughed at the Garand, dismissed it as a fragile, unnecessary tool, but in the end, the weapon that had been underestimated was the very one that had changed the outcome of the war. They mocked it once. They never mocked it again.